Since you're drafting your personal narrative essays this week, I wanted to talk briefly about good introduction and conclusion strategies, and also more generally about what introductions and conclusions are meant to do, and finally, some things not to do in your intro and your conclusion. So let's start with the purpose of the introduction. The introduction is designed for three primary purposes. It needs to attract the reader's attention, which means that the first one or two, possibly three sentences of the introduction need to serve as a hook to engage readers and make them want to read further. It needs to introduce the topic and then lead into the thesis statement, which should be the last sentence of the introduction. And it needs to house that thesis statement, again, which is the last sentence of the introduction. So you want to make sure that your introductions grab the reader's attention, set up or introduce your topic, and then lead into that last sentence, which is your thesis statement. Now, the difficult thing about introductions can be finding out the best way to start your paper, and it's going to change from paper to paper depending on your purpose and your tone and your audience and all of those things. But a lot of times we find ourselves, staring at a blank screen, trying to think of the perfect way to start. And often that leads to not being able to start at all. Now, you are writing a rough draft, which means your introduction doesn't have to be perfect. But when in doubt, there are some go-to strategies that you can keep in your writer's toolbox that will often work for you if you can't figure out a way to introduce your paper. You can tell a story, a brief, relevant anecdote. You don't want this to be too lengthy and in-depth because it is just your hook. It doesn't need to take up, half a page by any means. But this can be a really good way to draw readers into whatever it is you're trying to do. You can ask a question, basically a provocative question, which doesn't necessarily mean controversial. It just means it literally provokes thought or provokes, further consideration. Typically, when you're going to ask a question, just be careful not to ask too many questions because then your reader starts to feel like they're being interrogated. But one strong provocative question to open your paper is a very good rhetorical strategy because you're literally inviting your readers to answer that question and thus into your paper. You can present a pertinent quotation. Again, this needs to be relevant. It needs to be relatively brief, and you'll need to provide a citation for where the quotation came from. But that can be a good way to open your paper. You can kind of do it one of two ways. You can set it above the introduction, almost like an epigraph to sort of set the tone, or you can make it the first sentence of your introduction. If you do that, just make sure it's not a standalone quote, meaning that you introduce it or attach it to your writing in some way and don't just stick the quote in there by itself and move on. You can present a surprising or interesting fact or statistic. Surprising or interesting are the key words there. You don't want to just start with some, boring fact or statistic or worse, something that your readers probably already know or are vaguely aware of. You want it to be something that your readers wouldn't expect and therefore are intrigued and want to read further. You can briefly describe a mystery to intrigue your readers. Our personal narrative sample paper about my father's legacy sort of does this when it says, when I was 16 years old, I met my father for the first time. Of course, he'd already been dead for 15 years when I met him or something like that. That's basically describing a mystery, like how on earth could she have met her dead father? So you want to read further and find out that, she's talking about meeting him through the letter that her mother wrote. You can use a relevant cultural reference. Again, you want to make sure that it doesn't feel out of nowhere or jarring when they move from there into the rest of your paper. But for example, if I were writing a paper on use of the insanity defense in America, obviously not for your personal narratives, but just in general, I might open by saying, seemingly every episode of Law & Order SVU contains someone pleading not guilty by reason of insanity or mental defect. I can even combine that with surprising fact or statistic. I can say, seemingly every episode of Law & Order SVU involves somebody, pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. However, actually, less than 2% of court cases in America involve the insanity plea, something like that. Those are some things that you can do. Here are some things not to do. Never start your paper with a dictionary definition. It's an easy go-to, but it's a crutch. Doesn't mean that you can't include definitions elsewhere in your paper. Definitions can be useful, but you don't want to open your paper with a definition because there's a reason people don't read the dictionary for fun, because it's boring. So it's definitely not something you want to do to try to engage readers. One of my pet peeves is papers that start with what I call empty sentences, which are obvious generalizations that basically tell readers what they already know, because that's not going to intrigue them. Probably the classic example I've seen of this was from a student who wrote an otherwise good paper on air quality control in Knoxville, where I used to live. And her first sentence was literally, all people need to breathe. And I should hope that everyone knows that all people need to breathe. So you're not doing anything to grab your reader's attention when you just tell them something they already know. You want to avoid shop-worn phrases like since the beginning of time, in today's society. The reasoning is anything that follows since the beginning of time is either going to be so generic that it doesn't need to be said, or it's going to be wrong. If I say since the beginning of time, man has warred with his fellow man. Well, maybe since the existence of man, but not since the beginning of time. It's just not something that needs to be said. And it's often a red flag that whatever comes next is going to be a problem. Same thing with in today's society. Too often in today's society is followed by something that's either a sweeping generalization or something so generic that no one needs to be told it. In today's society, people rely heavily on technology. Thanks, writer, for telling me that. Or, in today's society, people are selfish. Well, that's a sweeping generalization. And it might even offend your readers. So again, in today's society is a red flag that whatever comes next is going to be a problem. You don't want to refer to your own title in your introduction. This is more because of formatting. Your paper will start immediately after your title. So if your title is, how I learned to be independent, and your first sentence is, I learned to be independent by moving 12 times when I was younger. It just feels repetitive or redundant to your readers to see those phrases back to back like that. And it's also a good idea for most papers, don't refer to the assignment itself and don't refer to your own research or writing process. Your readers don't really need to know how you got to your topic. And they're not familiar with your assignment. Remember, you're writing for a general academic audience. They have no idea what the assignment is and don't need to know that you're writing for an assignment at all. So if you say something like, when I first got this personal narrative assignment, I considered writing about a number of topics, including my first horse, Buttercup, and my uncle's death 12 years ago. Then I thought further and decided I wanted to write about, etc. Your readers don't need to know the background of how you got to your topic. You just need to get into your topic out the gate and engage them without kind of pulling the curtain back in that way. So let's look at these two versions of the same introduction. Neither of these introductions is bad. It's just that one is better, is more engaging, and has a stronger sense of authorship or voice. You always want your paper to sound like you and to be something unique to you. So you want to, again, avoid that idea of genericness and establish your voice strongly in the introduction and then later in the conclusion especially. So we've got, since the beginning of time, man has warred against his fellow man. There are soldiers in every generation. Some families pass down a military legacy. In my family, men have served in every American war of the last century, including World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War. Now I have a son born 3 months ago. Though I am proud of my family's service, I don't know if I want my son to serve. Perhaps it's time for a Walton man to start a new tradition. Again, this is not a bad intro. It would not be a bad rough draft intro, but it could use some jazzing up because since the beginning of time, man has warred against his fellow man. Again, doesn't need to be said and isn't truly accurate. And we've got that problematic since the beginning of time red flag. Then we've got there are soldiers in every generation. Again, does your reader really need you to tell them that? Some families pass down a military legacy. Again, we know. So that really the introduction truly starts with individuality and uniqueness and voice. With, in my family, men have served in every American war of the last century, including World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Gulf War. That's, now we're getting there. And everything after that is honestly fine. It's just that opening hook is overly generic and it's just not popping. So let's see, even if that were my rough draft introduction, how might I, jazz it up for my final draft so that it really engages readers? This author chose to open with a quote that's actually a song lyric from My Father's Son by Ricky Skaggs. They say God gives us comfort when the time of trouble comes. They say we'll know no share of peace till we lay down our guns. But will my boy have the chance to do the things I've never done? Or will he, like me, be told that he must be his father's son? It's a fairly well-known song. It's a very evocative song. And it really sets the tone or the stage for what this paper is going to be about, which is questioning whether this father wants to pass down his legacy to his own son, or does he want to break this kind of cycle? And then we've got, my grandfather was wounded in the Philippines during World War II. My father fought alongside South Vietnamese soldiers during the Tet Offensive, and I helped drive Iraqi soldiers out of Kaf Ji during the Gulf War. Men in my family have served in every American war of the last century. I've always been proud of my service and that of my forefathers. Growing up, I never questioned my destiny of joining the military. However, 3 months ago, my own son was born. I am proud of my family's service, but when I imagine it, the infinite future open to my son, I don't know if I want him to tread in our well-worn footprints. Perhaps it's time for Walton Man to start a new tradition. What we've got here, it really takes the sort of generic bits of the first introduction and gives us a quote to set the tone and draw readers in, readers who are familiar with the song, especially. It opens with even more specificity than the first one. It's not just they served in these wars. It's very personal. It's my grandfather was wounded. My father fought. I helped. And really see almost a sort of a montage of these different generations of Walton soldiers and their experiences. And then just a little bit more about, how he's reflecting on whether he wants his young son, 18 years down the road, to be the next, slide in that family slideshow. So really think about ways to make your introduction as engaging. You can be specific. You can offer details that you're going to elaborate on later in the paper to make your introduction pop. Conclusions can be even more difficult to write than introductions. Largely because once we get to the conclusion, we feel like we've said everything we want to say, and we really don't feel like we have anything else to add. And so a lot of times we just kind of stack on a few kind of flabby generic sentences and call it a day. The problem with that is your conclusion is your last chance to get your readers. So it needs to be the strongest paragraph in your paper, and that can be hard to do. Your conclusion needs to re-emphasize, but not just repeat your main ideas. You don't want to just repeat word for word your thesis statement or other main ideas. You just want to re-emphasize them, remind readers what this paper is about, what's at stake. You want to provide that sense of closure or completeness. You want to make sure that your paper does truly end and not just stop. And most importantly, you want to leave your readers with a strong, lasting impression of what you want them to get out of your essay. You don't want to do this in the second person. You don't want to say what you should get out of this essay is, but they should know what you're writing about. Again, what's at stake, what's the main idea or the main message that you're trying to send. Again, there are some go-to strategies that you can use when you're struggling with a conclusion. You can answer the question, so what? That emphasizes the stakes of the paper. Okay, after all of this, so what? Why does this matter? Sometimes it's going to matter on a very personal level, such as in a personal narrative. Sometimes it's going to matter on a more global level, such as when you're doing an argument paper. So emphasizing that so what can be a good way to re-emphasize your thesis and really make readers realize, what the significance of what you've just written is. Synthesize, don't summarize. What that means is you don't want to just go through all the points of your paper in your conclusion in exactly the order in which you wrote them, which would be a summary. You want to synthesize. You want to take the elements of your paper that you've given so far, and you want to combine them into something new, or at least with a sort of a new variation or a new way of seeing it or putting it, in order to refresh readers and not bore them right at the end. You can redirect your readers depending on the paper and whether that's appropriate in terms of where can they go next. You can create new meaning, basically take everything that you've said so far and, offer a new way of, again, looking at it or a new perspective on it or something the readers may not have thought of so far. One technique I really like is what I call the kind of full circle effect. It's basically whatever you did in your introduction, you can echo that same strategy in your conclusion. So for example, if I were writing a paper on stem cell research. And I opened with the story of, young Charlie who, has a debilitating disease that stem cell research might be able to cure, but there are restrictions on what stem cell research is allowed. Then in my conclusion, I can return to young Charlie, not tell the same exact story again, but follow up with, so if the, federal regulations regarding stem cell research aren't changed, Charlie may never, live the full life he deserves, something like that. It creates this very nice, neat, full package effect. Even in my conclusion, I can pose a question. Again, you want it to be a question that your readers can answer, and you want it to be a question that is still provocative and thought-provoking. You don't want it to just be a yes or no question or a fact-based question. But if you want to leave your readers thinking, ask them a question that will make them think. And you can also look to the future. This can happen in a personal narrative paper. This can happen in a research paper, all kinds of papers you can look to. Okay, well, what's next? I had a student write his personal narrative about how he was a lifetime military man and he, struggled to connect with his daughter. And then he talked about driving her to college and how that kind of made him realize that he needed to open up to her, etc. It was a very effective paper. And then in his conclusion, he talked kind of a little bit about, okay, what's next? What's the next stage of their relationship? What's the next thing he hopes to connect with her over? Or, where does he see themselves in, 5 or 10 years or whatever? And that was a really good strategy as well. Once again, there are things you don't want to do in your conclusion. The first one, even though it feels like a go-to, is actually something you don't want to do, which is don't start your conclusion with in conclusion. And the reason for that is it's a very forced transition, and it's basically like a blinking neon sign that says, I'm concluding now. And hopefully you can make a more subtle, effective, and meaningful transition from your last body paragraph into your conclusion without just having to sort of fall back on in conclusion or in summation or to sum up or whatever. Generally speaking, you don't want to end your conclusion with a quote. It's really important to end on your own voice because, again, the intro and the conclusion are the most powerful paragraphs to establish your voice and your authenticity and your authorship of the paper. And if you end on a quote, you're sort of ending on a voice that's not your own, and it can kind of diminish your own voice and your own authorship of the paper. If you find yourself wanting to end on a quote, consider following up on that quote with one more sentence in your own voice that ties it back to, in your personal narrative, your own experience and how that quote relates or something like that. Avoid restating your thesis or other points word for word. I mentioned this earlier. You want to reemphasize, not just repeat. Again, avoid summary. It's what I call a microwave conclusion. It's where you take all of the ideas that you've given in your paper and you repeat them in the same order that they appeared in the essay. And the problem with that is even no matter how like fresh or amazing those ideas and whatnot were the first time your readers read them, if they see them again in your conclusion in the exact same way, in the exact same order, then it loses a lot of that freshness. It's like if you eat an amazing meal at one evening at a restaurant and you have leftovers and you take them home and you stick them in the microwave the next day, it may still be good, but it's never as good. And so you're almost robbing the original power of your points by repeating them at the end and telling your reader something that they just read in the same way that they just read it. It is okay to add new information into a conclusion as long as it fits with everything that's already been said. You want to avoid introducing entirely new info that needs an entire new essay to deal with, because it's basically taking a sharp left turn into a whole nother topic, which is not something that you want to do when you're trying to provide a sense of closure in your own paper. Which is to say your paper really does need to end and it doesn't just stop. If your reader, flips to the next page expecting there to be more and there isn't, that's a sign that your paper just stopped and didn't end. Your readers didn't get that sense of closure. I'm going to use 2 examples of conclusions in the next slide. They are on the topic of sexual assault or rape. If that's something that you don't want to hear about or read, then feel free to skip this section. So let's say I had written a paper on rape in the legal system in America and sort of rape culture and the reluctance of victims to come forward. I've got two examples of the same conclusion here again. Neither one is bad, but one is better. And we'll talk a little bit about why one is better. We'll actually start with the first one. And conclusions are tough because you haven't read what came before, but hopefully you'll get a sense of why this is a strong conclusion. For these reasons, despite advances in public perception and legal protection of rape victims, rape is still a difficult subject in our culture. In particular, while violent rape attacks often lead to straightforward convictions, other instances such as date rape, statutory rape, spousal rape, female and male rape, etc., fall into what some consider a gray area. These incidents rarely result in conviction, and that's in the unlikely event that the victim even comes forward. Even when the victims do report a rape, they face a long road to justice. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, out of every 100 rapes in America, 46 are reported to police, 12 lead to an arrest, 9 are prosecuted, 5 result in a felony conviction, and only 3 rapists will ever spend a single day in prison. With these statistics and a system that ranks rape like some forms are better than others, is it any wonder that so many victims fail to seek justice? Let's compare that to the second one, and then we'll talk about why the first one is a stronger conclusion. In conclusion, rape is a terrible crime with much legal complexity. Many victims never come forward to accuse their attackers, but when they do, prosecutors must then decide on how to charge them. The justice system identifies different kinds of rape based on who is involved, the specific scenario in which the rape occurred, and the level of physical violence involved. These differences result in different sentences for the convicted rapist. Interestingly, regardless of the specific conviction, all rapists are entered in the National Sex Offender Public Registry, meaning their crime can follow them long after their release from prison. How would you like to be marked as a rapist for the rest of your life? So again, this second conclusion, while it has some problems, isn't terrible. Again, it wouldn't be a terrible rough draft conclusion, but there are some issues with it that could be improved. To start, the transition into the conclusion is very forced. It's just, in conclusion, I'm going to conclude now. Rape is a terrible crime with much legal complexity. You get the impression that this conclusion is going through every subtopic in the paper in order in which they were presented. It's got a lot of legal complexity. It's many victims don't come forward. Then prosecutors have to decide how to charge them. And this is how that happens. And then you get to the end where suddenly we're introduced to the National Sex Offender Public Registry, which in this particular paper hadn't been mentioned to this point. So it's a total hard turn into a new topic that would make an excellent topic for a research paper, but doesn't belong in the conclusion of this paper. And then we have this ending on a question, which isn't a bad technique, but it's a bad question. How would you like to be marked as a rapist for the rest of your life? Basically, there aren't a lot of hard and fast rules in writing. One of them is probably don't accuse your readers of being potential rapists. It's a very sort of aggressive question that your readers, first of all, will answer with, I would not like that, thanks, and move on. And it just sets a very unpleasant tone that leaves your readers feeling sort of unsettled and defensive in a way that doesn't help the paper. Compare that to the first conclusion. We've got a much more natural transition for these reasons. So we assume we're following up on whatever was talked about in the previous paragraph. Despite advances in public perception and legal protection, rape is still a difficult subject. It's, more specific. It's more in depth. It even contains a new statistic, and that's okay. A lot of people think that they can't put anything in the conclusion that they haven't already said in the paper, which means no new source material, no new info at all. But that's not the case at all. For example, this statistic was deliberately saved for the conclusion because it is so striking. If readers remember nothing else about this essay, they'll probably remember that startling statistic that of every 100 rapes in America, only 3 rapists will ever spend a single day in prison. So saving that really impactful statistic for the conclusion, such that the conclusion really resonates and captures readers, is a great technique. Introducing a whole new topic like the public registry, not a great technique, but saving impactful material for the conclusion, as long as it doesn't require further explanation and fits with what came before, is a really good technique. And then we've got the final question, which is a much better question than the other one. With these statistics and a system that ranks rape like some forms are better than others, is it any wonder that so many victims fail to seek justice? Leaving readers thinking about the complexity of this, crime in our culture and what may lead victims not to report the crime and not to tell anybody about it potentially ever or for years later. And so it's not an easy question to answer, and readers are going to have to leave thinking about it, but you've also equipped them to think about it with the information in your paper. So that's why that's a better conclusion. So basically, as you're drafting your paper, don't feel like your introduction and conclusion have to be perfect. They don't. It's a rough draft. But the more you think about some of these strategies, the more it may help you get a foothold on a strong intro and a strong conclusion. And then once we move next week into the final draft of the paper, those are 2 paragraphs that you should really focus on to make sure that they're as strong as they can be, because they should be the 2 strongest paragraphs in your essay.